He stood there in the middle of the National Guard cafeteria, quiet as a church pew at dawn, while every young soldier around him rose to their feet in stunned respect. Moments earlier, he'd been dismissed as just another old man with a worn jacket. But now the entire room stood frozen, realizing they were in the presence of a legend who never bragged about a single thing he'd survived. What could possibly turn a casual joke into a moment that humbled an entire unit? If this story moves you, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who'd appreciate it, and subscribe for more stories of faith, honor, and real American courage. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. The rural Midwestern National Guard Armory cafeteria hummed with the restless rhythm of a weekend drill, the kind where young soldiers pushed through the double doors with trays clattering and laughter rolling across the room like warm thunder. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, tired but steady, bathing the metal tables and old bulletin boards in a washed-out glow that felt both familiar and comforting. Outside, a cold November wind brushed against the brick walls, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant farm fields. Inside, boots shuffled, jokes flew, and the easy confidence of youth filled every corner. It was the kind of loud, lived-in American moment that hid its depth behind routine, until the right person quietly walked through it. Samuel Sawtooth Briggs stepped into that noise with a presence so gentle it almost disappeared beneath the chatter. He walked slowly but with purpose, each step measured, as though he had long ago learned to enter rooms without demanding space. His field jacket, though neatly kept, bore the creases of a life lived outdoors and under hard conditions. His eyes held a calm warmth, but behind them lay something deeper, a heaviness only men who had seen too much ever truly carried. He didn't look like someone who wanted attention. He looked like someone who hoped the world would let him pass unnoticed. He approached the row of tables set aside for the Veterans Outreach Breakfast, a small event meant to bridge generations of service. The young guardsman barely paused as he moved past them, the loud banter bouncing from wall to wall. Briggs lifted a paper cup of coffee, nodded politely at a few soldiers who glanced his way, and searched for a quiet seat, one close enough to feel part of the room, but far enough from the center of attention. He had always preferred to observe life rather than be the focus of it. The cafeteria's mismatched chairs scraped across the floor as soldiers jockeyed for seats. Their conversations wrapped around hunting trips, drill weekends, and plans after service. Training posters curled at the edges on the walls, and the American flag hung proudly above the room, a reminder of duty, sacrifice, and the vast history that tied them all together. The young men laughed loudly, full of ironclad confidence and the untested pride of early adulthood. Briggs watched them with a faint, knowing half-smile. For a moment, he felt almost invisible, and that suited him perfectly. He had come simply to share a meal, to honor the young soldiers who kept the tradition of service alive, and maybe to sit in the presence of the flag one more time in a place that still respected it. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, warming his fingers, and breathed in the comfort of a room that smelled of scrambled eggs, bacon, and ordinary American life. This was the peace he cherished, the kind far removed from the memories he rarely discussed. But even as he settled into his seat, something subtle shifted in the air. A few soldiers at a nearby table glanced at him with curiosity, wondering who the old man was, why he sat alone, and what stories might linger behind those tired, patient eyes. Briggs kept his gaze lowered, hoping their interest would fade. He had lived long enough to know that curiosity, especially among young men wanting to prove themselves, could turn sharply if given the wrong spark. The noise around him rose and fell in waves, metal silverware tapping against plates, boots thudding rhythmically on the linoleum floor. Yet amid all that movement, Briggs remained still, the single quiet center of a storm not yet formed. He didn't know it, but the next few minutes would pull him directly into the heart of a moment he never asked for and never wanted. One careless sentence, spoken by a young man eager to impress, would soon shift the atmosphere of the entire cafeteria. Across the room, The young recruits joked with each other, full of confidence sharpened by peer approval. Their voices carried easily, cutting through the hum of the cafeteria as they bragged, teased and pushed each other around with the harmless bravado that came naturally to them. Briggs, meanwhile, took a slow sip of his coffee, unaware that he was about to become the unintended target of their loud attention. There was nothing threatening in his posture, nothing boastful in the way he carried himself. He simply looked like an old man trying to eat in peace, a man whose shoulders had long carried more weight than the room could guess. But life has a way of revealing truths when least expected, and sometimes all it takes is the wrong joke spoken at the wrong moment to bring hidden history roaring back into the present. The stage was set, even though no one recognized it yet. The young soldiers continued to laugh. The old veteran continued to sit quietly at his table, and the cafeteria remained just another familiar drill weekend scene. But a storm was gathering in the space between generations, waiting for the spark that would change the room forever. Ryan Keller noticed Briggs before anyone else at his table did. He spotted the old man sitting alone, leaning slightly forward over his coffee, and something in Keller's young, restless ego sparked with the need to say something, anything, that might lift him above the noise and earn a quick laugh from the guys beside him. He was 20, full of pride, and carried that familiar mix of insecurity and bravado that pushed young soldiers to act louder and tougher than they felt inside. When he nudged his friend and nodded toward Briggs, the moment shifted, even if nobody recognized its importance yet. Keller leaned back in his chair, letting his grin spread wide, and spoke loud enough to cut through the cafeteria's steady buzz of clattering trays and casual conversation. "Back in your day," he called out, waving a fork as if conducting the room, "did they even have real equipment?" His voice carried across the space with the sharpness of a joke meant for an audience, not a conversation. A few recruits snorted. Someone slapped the table. The laughter came fast, because laughter always comes fast when youth feels superior. Briggs didn't react at first. He kept his eyes lowered, his hands wrapped around the warm cup as if he were sitting alone in a diner 40 miles away, instead of surrounded by dozens of young guardsmen. His silence wasn't the silence of weakness or fear. It was the silence of a man who had heard far worse from life than a careless remark from a young recruit trying to impress his friends. He breathed slowly, letting the sting of disrespect pass through him like a cold wind slipping under a door. But Keller noticed the silence, and silence fueled him. He smirked, emboldened by the reaction from his table, leaning forward as if preparing to strike again. The moment was small, almost trivial on the surface, but beneath the surface something began to tremble, the first tremor of a moral imbalance. Some of the recruits continued laughing, but a few shifted awkwardly in their seats, glancing between Keller and the old man with uncertainty. Even in youth, the human heart knows when a line might be forming. Keller rolled his shoulders back and prepared another jab, eager to hold the room's attention a moment longer. His tone stiffened with the self-assurance of someone who believed age diminished worth rather than deepened it. "Seriously, sir," he added, louder this time, "what was your rank back then? Or did they just hand out uniforms to anybody?" His friends roared again, and the sound bounced off the cafeteria walls like a challenge hurled across generations. Briggs took in a slow breath but still refused to answer. He didn't flinch. He didn't scowl. He didn't even lift his head. His quietness wasn't avoidance. It was strength restrained, patience practiced, humility chosen. Yet the more he remained silent, the more Keller mistook it for weakness. The young recruit shifted in his seat, feeling victorious though he had earned nothing. He believed he held the upper hand, unaware of the truth resting only a heartbeat away. Around them, the cafeteria's atmosphere thickened. The noise didn't quite fade, but it changed, like a crowd sensing a storm rolling in, even while the sun still shines. A few soldiers nudged each other, uncertainty creeping into their faces. They didn't know who Briggs was, but they knew enough to feel uncomfortable with the cruelty blooming in the room. Respect runs deep in small-town America, and something about teasing an old veteran didn't sit right with everyone. Briggs lifted his eyes, finally acknowledging Keller's voice. His gaze was calm, steady, and impossibly gentle for a man being mocked so openly. That alone unsettled the recruits who watched. There was no anger in him, only a quiet sadness, the kind that comes from seeing history repeat itself in the young. For a moment, he considered letting the moment pass entirely. He had spent decades mastering the art of silence, but some lessons he knew do not teach themselves. Keller mistook that gentle look for confirmation that his joke had won the day. He leaned in the slightest bit closer, his grin fading into something sharper, more eager for dominance. His voice dropped lower, but it carried farther because the room had begun to still. "Come on, old-timer," he said. "Don't be shy. Just tell us what you used to be." Briggs let the words settle, allowed them to echo and land where they needed to. The cafeteria seemed to pause in its rhythm, as if watching for his reaction. His fingers tightened just slightly around the coffee cup. He knew a storm was coming. Not because he wanted one, but because the truth has a way of rising when humility is mistaken for weakness. He prepared to speak, not to defend himself, but because a young man's heart was steering dangerously off course. In that moment, the room was balanced on the edge of a single breath. Keller waited. The recruits watched. Briggs exhaled, steady and unbroken. And with one quiet answer about to form on his lips, the entire cafeteria stood unknowingly at the brink of a revelation that would change everything. The cafeteria's lively chatter began to fracture the moment Keller's second insult echoed across the tables. What had been an easy wave of drill weekend noise suddenly thinned into uneasy patches of silence, as if a cold wind had slipped through a cracked window and brushed against the backs of the young soldiers. A few recruits who had been laughing moments earlier exchanged glances that carried the first flickers of regret, realizing the old man at the table wasn't reacting with irritation, anger, or defensiveness, just quiet endurance. There was something in that stillness that made the air feel heavier, something that hinted at a line many felt but none could quite define. Keller didn't see any of it. His confidence ballooned under the shallow applause of his friends, making him sit a little taller, grin a little wider, and lean forward with triumph he hadn't earned. The victory he imagined felt hollow to those watching more closely. Several of the soldiers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the tone the room was taking, sensing disrespect toward an elder, especially one who wore the look of a man who'd lived through far more than he let show. The cafeteria's laughter didn't stop entirely, but it fractured into uneasy fragments. Briggs sat still, his hands folded over the rim of his coffee cup, the steam rising in soft, trembling wisps. He didn't bow his head, but neither did he meet Keller's stare. Instead, he breathed deeply, letting each breath steady him the way a man does when memories begin to rise from darker corners. He had endured insults before, from enemies, from life itself, from a world that never fully understood what men like him had carried. Yet something inside him stirred, a quiet tension he rarely allowed to surface. Keller leaned forward on his elbows, sensing momentary dominance. He mistook the shifting atmosphere in the room as an invitation to escalate, not realizing he was pushing the crowd toward a breaking point. "Come on, old-timer," he called out again, loud enough for several nearby tables to turn their heads. "You wearing that jacket because you earned it, or just because it looks cool?" The laughter that followed was thinner now, not as confident as before, wobbling under the pressure of conscience. The soldiers sitting closest to Briggs began to watch him intently, waiting to see if he would react. Something about his gentleness unsettled them. It was the way he held himself, not with fragility, but with restraint, like someone who knew the cost of letting certain emotions loose. A few recruits lowered their voices, realizing this wasn't the kind of joke that stayed funny for long. The cafeteria wasn't divided by rank or table now. It was divided by moral instinct. A pack mentality formed around Keller's table, not because they felt right, but because they wanted to appear confident in front of each other. Young men often follow the loudest voice until it becomes clear that voice is leading them in the wrong direction. And across from them, a smaller cluster of soldiers watched Briggs with growing respect. Sensing something about him they couldn't yet name but felt strongly in their gut, a quiet authority, the kind that didn't need stripes on a sleeve to be real. Briggs finally lifted his head, not to confront Keller, but to observe the room around him. His eyes were soft, steady, and quiet, the eyes of a man who had learned long ago that battles worth fighting rarely began with raised voices. The recruits closest to him felt the temperature of the room shift even more. Something unseen but powerful filled the space between the old man and the young soldiers, a rising awareness that this wasn't just an awkward moment. It was the beginning of something larger. Some recruits stared at Keller with expressions that had begun to sour, no longer entertained by his attempts at humor. The cafeteria felt like a river splitting into two currents, one shallow and noisy, one deeper and silent. The scraping of a chair, the shuffle of boots, the hum of the aging lights overhead, every sound seemed sharper now, as if the entire room was listening for the next move. Keller took the divided silence as a challenge rather than a warning. He sat forward with renewed arrogance, his grin sharpening into something smug. "So," he said, letting the word hang in the air like bait, "you gonna tell us what your rank was back in? Whatever century you served?" The embarrassment creeping over his friends' faces didn't reach him. Pride blinded him to the shift happening all around. The cafeteria settled into an uneasy quiet, one that stretched just long enough for everyone present to feel the weight of Keller's words. The young man had crossed a line, even if he didn't understand how deep it ran. The room's division was complete, two sides watching a single old veteran who had not yet spoken a word. The moment held its breath, waiting for what came next. Briggs allowed the silence to settle fully before he made even the smallest movement, taking a slow, steady sip of his coffee as if the world hadn't narrowed its gaze onto him. There was no trembling in his hands, no flicker of emotion crossing his face, only a stillness so profound that it made Keller's loudness look childish by comparison. The old veteran didn't glare or bristle or defend himself. Instead, he offered the room the same calm patience a grandfather might give a child throwing a tantrum. Keller misread that silence instantly. He saw it as confirmation that he had the upper hand, that the old man had no comeback and no confidence, that he was just some relic visiting the armory for a free meal. The recruit rocked back in his chair with a victorious smirk, exchanging looks with his buddies who tried to laugh along but couldn't quite manage the same conviction as before. What once sounded funny now tasted bitter. Briggs set his cup down gently, the soft clink barely audible above the hum of the lights. His posture remained relaxed, but his eyes shifted slightly, a movement so subtle yet so meaningful that several soldiers nearby straightened instinctively, sensing depth where Keller had presumed emptiness. Briggs wasn't avoiding confrontation. He was choosing grace over pride, restraint over anger. That choice alone made the tension thicken even more, like a held breath stretching through the room. The soldiers watching felt something they couldn't yet articulate. There was a quiet strength emanating from Briggs, a strength that didn't shout, didn't boast, didn't compete, the kind of strength forged in places young men rarely imagined. Some guardsmen exchanged glances as they began piecing together a new thought. Men who stay silent under insult often do so because they've faced far worse adversity than the loudest voices in the room. Keller pushed the moment further, trying to wring one more laugh from his audience. "He probably can't remember his rank," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Bet he just wandered in here, thinking it's bingo night." The joke fell flatter this time, landing with a dull thud in a room that no longer wanted to catch it. Even his friends hesitated, their uneasy shifting betraying the first signs of doubt. Briggs finally exhaled slowly, a breath that sounded almost like a prayer, not for himself, but for the young man who didn't know how close he was to stumbling over something sacred. He lifted his gaze just enough for his eyes to meet Keller's across the tables. For a heartbeat, the two generations stared at each other, one filled with superficial pride, the other with quiet history. And in that brief exchange, several soldiers felt a chill, sensing the reverence of a moment larger than they understood. Some of the younger guardsmen began whispering under their breaths, trying to identify the old man. There was something strangely familiar about the way he carried himself, something that didn't match the picture of frailty Keller was trying to paint. A few soldiers stood a little straighter, choosing instinctively to side with the veteran whose calm presence commanded more respect than any raised voice could. Briggs didn't choose that authority. It simply grew around him, drawn from the quiet dignity with which he accepted each insult. His humility magnified the injustice in the room, making Keller's arrogance look sharper, harsher, more out of place. The more silent Briggs remained, the louder the young man's disrespect seemed, like a discordant note in a song everyone knew by heart. The atmosphere in the cafeteria tightened, the tension coiling like a rope pulled taut. The young men who trusted their gut, the ones raised to respect elders, veterans, and the quiet strength of those who came before, began to turn emotionally toward Briggs. Meanwhile, Keller, blind to the shift, grew bolder in his ignorance. He couldn't see that the room was no longer laughing with him but waiting for a reckoning. And Briggs, still patient, still composed, weighed his next move with the care of a man who understood that even a single sentence, spoken at the right moment, could change the course of a young man's life. He didn't want humiliation or revenge. He wanted something deeper, a lesson, a moment of clarity, a gentle correction. But before he could offer it, the room itself would force the story forward, because humility this deep cannot remain unnoticed forever. Briggs finally lifted his chin, breaking the long silence with a small, almost apologetic breath. The cafeteria, already tense from Keller's relentless prodding, seemed to fold inward as the old man prepared to speak. His voice, when it came, was soft meant only for the young recruit, not for the entire room. "My rank," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of decades, "was Chief Petty Officer." He paused, his gaze steady but humble. Samuel Briggs. The name slipped from his lips with no pride, no expectation, only the honest simplicity of a man who had lived long enough to see no need for boasting. The recruit sitting closest to him leaned forward instinctively, sensing something in the air shift. Keller opened his mouth to respond, an arrogant smirk returning, as if he were ready to twist even this truth into another joke. But before he could speak, a sudden stiffness cut through the cafeteria, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Captain Mason Ortega, who had been standing near the far corner reviewing training schedules, turned abruptly. His eyes locked onto Briggs with the kind of recognition reserved for names found in old military history archives, not in a small-town armory cafeteria. His clipboard slipped slightly in his hand, his posture straightening like a man struck by a cold rush of realization. A hush began to ripple outward, starting with the soldiers nearest the captain and spreading across the room like a slow wave pulling back from the shore. Ortega stepped forward with sharp, purposeful strides, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. Several recruits watched him approach, confused, whispering quietly as they tried to understand why their normally composed captain suddenly moved with such intensity. But those whispers died the moment he spoke. "Chief Petty Officer Samuel Briggs?" Ortega's voice cut through the cafeteria, steady but carrying more emotion than any of the young guardsmen had ever heard from him. The rest of the room froze mid-bite, mid-sentence, even mid-step. Every fork stopped halfway to a plate. Boots halted against the linoleum. Conversations collapsed into silence. The tension that had hung over the old man moments earlier transformed instantly into something heavier reverence, mixed with disbelief. Briggs lifted his eyes, recognizing the tone long before he recognized the man. He nodded once, modestly, almost as if he regretted speaking his name aloud. "Yes, sir," he replied gently, though it's been a long time since anyone used the title. The humility in his voice only deepened the shock in Ortega's expression. The captain swallowed, visibly moved, and for a moment he seemed unsure whether to stand taller or bow his head. Ortega reached the table and stopped, looking at Briggs the way a young soldier might look at a name etched into a memorial wall, one he had read about, respected, and believed belonged to a different era altogether. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice out of instinctive respect, "forgive me." "I didn't know you were in town." Several recruits exchanged glances, trying to piece together what could cause their captain, a man not easily shaken, to speak to a civilian as though addressing a legend. One of the soldiers whispered under his breath, "Who is he?" Another murmured, "Captain Ortega knows him?" The uncertainty in the air shifted into awe, the room straining to understand what was unfolding. Keller stared at the scene, his confidence draining faster than he could comprehend. His smirk evaporated, replaced by widening eyes and a sick, sinking feeling creeping up his spine. He had a dawning sense that he had pushed far beyond the bounds of ignorance and perhaps insulted someone far more important than he ever imagined. The captain drew in a slow breath before speaking again. "Are you the Briggs from the Lady operation?" His voice cracked just slightly on the last word, revealing how deeply the name Briggs had struck him. A murmur swept the cafeteria at the mention of Lady, though most of the young guardsmen knew only fragments of what that word meant in American military history. Briggs shifted uneasily, as though uncomfortable with the path the conversation was taking. He nodded slowly, reluctantly confirming what Ortega already knew. A stunned silence washed over the entire room. Even the soldiers who didn't know the specifics felt the gravity of the moment, as if the air itself thickened. And in that silence, something ancient and profound began to rise: respect, reverence, and the unmistakable scent of truth revealing itself after years of quiet. Captain Ortega straightened his uniform unconsciously, taking a step back, his voice lowering into something solemn. "Chief, it's an honor to have you here." The recruits who had been laughing minutes earlier now sat frozen, their hearts pounding with the realization that the man they mocked was not just another old veteran, but the kind of man whose name lived in the footnotes of history, in whispered stories passed between generations of service members, in the quiet corners of training manuals where legends lived. Everything in the room shifted in that instant. The truth had surfaced, and all arrogance melted beneath its weight. The silence that followed the captain's words was unlike anything the armory cafeteria had experienced before. It was not the quiet of a room settling down after a meal, or the lull between conversations. It was the heavy, reverent silence that falls when people suddenly realize they are in the presence of something greater than themselves. Forks hung motionless in midair, coffee cooled, untouched in plastic cups. Boots that had been tapping rhythmically against the linoleum now stood perfectly still. The room had frozen, not by command, but by awe. Keller felt the weight of that silence first. His stomach twisted sharply, as though something deep inside him recognized the gravity of his mistake before his mind fully caught up. His throat went dry, and the laughter that had once filled his chest turned into a hollow ache. The old man he had mocked, the old man he had dismissed as irrelevant, was now being addressed with a level of respect Keller had never witnessed in this cafeteria. His face drained of color, the bravado evaporating from him like mist under a rising sun. Captain Ortega took another step toward Briggs, lowering his head slightly, the way one might approach a survivor of something monumental, something painful, something almost sacred. "Chief Petty Officer Briggs," he said again, his voice steadier but still tinged with reverence. "UDT, Lady, Sir, we learned about your team in training. I didn't think I'd ever meet someone who actually lived through that." The cafeteria seemed to lean closer collectively, every young soldier hungry for context, for meaning, for the story behind the name they had just heard. Briggs shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable with the spotlight. He did not smile. He did not nod proudly. Instead, he lowered his gaze, as if old memories weighed heavily against the glory others might try to project onto him. "I was part of a team," he answered softly. "Just a team of good men doing what needed to be done." His humility only intensified the sense of awe sweeping across the room. The recruits who had laughed earlier now looked as though they wished desperately to disappear beneath the tables. One soldier snapped instinctively to attention, not because he was ordered to, but because some instinctual respect compelled him to stand. Another followed, then another. The sound of chairs scraping back filled the cafeteria, not loud but powerful in unison. Soon, nearly every guardsman in the room was on their feet, back straight, eyes forward. They didn't know all the details of Briggs' history, but they knew enough to understand that respect was owed, deeply and unquestionably. Keller remained seated for a moment longer, frozen in shame, unable to move. His friends glanced at him with wide eyes, silently urging him to stand before he embarrassed himself further. But Keller's pride, so loud moments before, had cracked. He slowly pushed himself to his feet, his legs feeling unsteady, as though the weight of his own ignorance had settled on his shoulders. He could barely look at Briggs, the shame burning so hard that his face felt hot despite the cool air of the cafeteria. Captain Ortega finally addressed the young recruit directly. "Private Keller," he said sharply, and the room tightened again. "You will stand at attention." Keller snapped upright, eyes fixed on a point far ahead, but his jaw trembled. Ortega stepped aside to face Briggs once more. "Chief, if there's anything we can do for you, anything, you need only say the word." The sincerity in his voice echoed off the cafeteria walls, filling the space that Keller's arrogance had tainted. Briggs lifted his gaze slowly, his expression neither angry nor triumphant. Instead, he looked quietly saddened, as though witnessing a younger version of a mistake he once made himself. "There's nothing to be done, Captain," he said gently. "Young men learn. Sometimes the hard way." The compassion in his voice struck the room like a final bell of truth, resonant and undeniable. For a moment, no one breathed. Even Keller dared not swallow. The old man's words carried a weight that was somehow heavier than discipline, and lighter than condemnation, an invitation toward humility, a chance for redemption, a reminder that grace often teaches where punishment fails. The cafeteria, still frozen, seemed to bow toward Briggs in collective reverence. The truth had been spoken, the room understood, and the young man who had believed himself the loudest voice now felt smaller than he had ever been. The silence in the cafeteria lingered like a thick fog, settling into every corner and pressing against every young soldier who had witnessed the exchange. For Keller, that silence felt suffocating. The weight of his actions finally landed on him with full force, sinking deep into his chest until he could barely keep his breath steady. He had not just mocked an elderly man. He had mocked a man whose quiet presence carried the kind of history Keller barely understood. The pride that had driven him moments earlier now felt like a heavy anchor around his neck, pulling him downward into a well of regret. Captain Ortega's expression hardened as he turned fully toward the young recruit, his jaw tightening with a resolve shaped by years of service and discipline. "Private Keller," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. Front and center, Keller's stomach dropped. His boots felt glued to the floor, but the captain's tone left no room for hesitation. He stepped forward stiffly, each movement small and strained, as if he feared the ground might swallow him whole. As he approached, every pair of eyes in the cafeteria followed him, their silent judgment amplifying his humiliation. Keller stood before the captain, spine rigid, gaze locked straight ahead, but the trembling in his jaw betrayed him. Captain Ortega stepped closer, his voice lowering but somehow growing heavier. "You disrespected a veteran," he said, "and not just any veteran. A man who served before most of us were even born. A man whose sacrifices are the reason you get to sit in that uniform today." Keller flinched as the truth struck him, sharper than any insult he had thrown. "Sir, Keller began, but Ortega raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "You will not speak," the captain commanded. "Not yet. You will stand there and understand the severity of what you've done." Keller swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat tightening painfully. He had never felt smaller, never felt more ashamed. The eyes of every soldier behind him burned into his back like a row of torches revealing his wrongdoing. Behind them, Briggs watched the scene unfold, his face filled not with satisfaction, but with a quiet sorrow. He had lived long enough to know the sting of youthful arrogance, but even longer to know the sting of regret. The boy didn't need punishing, he needed guiding. Briggs rested his hands on the table, steadying himself as he rose slowly from his seat, each movement deliberate, like a man weighed down more by memory than age. Keller caught the movement from the corner of his eye, and something inside him collapsed further. He had insulted this man, this humble, quiet, historic man. The realization burned deeper with every passing second, stripping away every leftover trace of pride. He wanted to apologize, but his throat felt too tight. Words failed him. All he could do was stand, shaking and silent, praying for some way to undo the damage he had caused. A murmur drifted through the room as Briggs approached. Every soldier stepped aside instinctively, creating a clear path for him, as though the air itself parted to make room. His boots tapped softly against the linoleum floor, a sound gentle but unmistakably commanding. Keller's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He had expected anger, maybe even a cold dismissal, but the old veteran's expression held something entirely different: compassion. Briggs reached the captain's side, placing a weathered hand gently on Ortega's arm. "Captain," he said softly, "that's enough." His voice carried no authority of rank, yet somehow it carried more authority than anyone else in the room possessed. Ortega glanced at him, surprised, but the old man's steady gaze softened the captain's rigid posture. Briggs had not come to shame the boy. He had come to teach him. He stepped closer to Keller, who could barely meet his eyes. For a long moment, Briggs said nothing, letting the silence press gently between them, not as condemnation, but as invitation. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for the entire cafeteria to hear, he said, "Son, everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do after them." The words were simple, but to Keller, they carried the weight of everything he had been too blind to see. The cafeteria breathed again, not loudly, not quickly, but in one long collective exhale. The reckoning had come, but so had the chance for redemption. Briggs stood before Keller with a posture that carried neither anger nor pride, but a deep and steady understanding, one that felt older than the walls of the armory itself. He looked at the young man the way a seasoned farmer might look at a fragile seedling bending in the wind, with patience, not ridicule. The entire cafeteria watched, waiting for the old veteran to lash out or recount his achievements. Instead, he spoke in a gentle tone that made his words even more powerful. "You didn't know," Briggs said, the corners of his eyes softening. "You were trying to impress your friends. I remember being young once too." Keller's breath shuddered out of him, shame tightening his shoulders. He couldn't lift his eyes, not after everything that had happened. But Briggs didn't push him. He simply stood there, calm and unwavering. "But son," he continued, "there are things a man learns only when he's willing to listen. Humility is one of them. Respect is another." His voice carried the warmth of a grandfather telling a story on a porch swing, but underneath that warmth was an unshakable truth Keller couldn't ignore. Captain Ortega stepped back respectfully, recognizing that this moment didn't belong to him. It belonged to the generations before him, the ones who had fought battles without modern equipment, without recognition, without the privilege of returning to cheering crowds. Briggs represented a chapter of American history written in salt water, courage, and the quiet faith of men who believed service was not about glory, but duty. And now he was using that legacy not to condemn, but to guide. Briggs took a slow breath, as though steadying himself before touching a memory he rarely allowed to surface. "Back in my day," he began, his voice soft but cutting through the silence, "we didn't always know if we'd see sunrise. We didn't have much, no fancy gear, no special comforts. Just grit, prayer, and the hope that we'd make it back to the men beside us." A hush settled deeper across the room, the young soldiers leaning in without even realizing they were doing it. He paused, eyes staring at a point far beyond the cafeteria, as if seeing a different shoreline under a different sky. "Lady," he murmured, almost to himself, "that night, we swam miles in the dark with nothing but knives strapped to our ankles and the good Lord watching over us." His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memory. A memory that lived in the creases of his hands and the quiet spaces behind his eyes. Keller felt his throat tighten with something heavier than shame, respect. Briggs blinked slowly, pulling himself gently back into the present. "I don't talk about it," he said softly. "Not because I'm hiding it, but because some things don't need repeating to prove they're real." He looked at Keller, then really looked at him. "You don't owe me anything except a lesson learned. And I believe you've learned it." The kindness in his tone cut deeper than anger ever could, carving humility into Keller's heart. Keller finally managed to meet Briggs' eyes, and the old man offered him a small, almost fatherly nod. It wasn't forgiveness handed out cheaply. It was forgiveness given freely, because compassion was stronger in Briggs than pride. The young recruit swallowed hard, feeling the weight lift slightly from his chest. The lesson was painful, but it was honest, and it was changing him in ways he didn't yet fully understand. Around them, soldiers watched with reverence, many of them feeling the sting of their own small regrets, moments they'd been careless with words, moments they'd overlooked the wisdom of someone older. Briggs' presence reminded them of a truth often forgotten in the rush of youth. Strength without humility is hollow, painfully hollow. And the quietest men often carry the real weight of a nation's history. Captain Ortega stepped forward again, slower this time, his expression filled with gratitude. "Chief," he said softly, "you didn't have to speak." Briggs shook his head gently. "Sometimes the Lord asks us to say what we'd rather keep quiet," he replied. The faith in his voice was steady, like an old hymn whispered from memory. The room seemed to grow warmer, calmer, more grounded. Finally, Briggs laid a hand on Keller's shoulder, light, steady, and unexpectedly reassuring. "Son," he said, "you have a good heart. Just make sure your voice follows it." Keller nodded quickly, emotion clogging his throat. In that one simple gesture, Briggs turned what could have been a moment of lifelong shame into a turning point of character. The cafeteria felt transformed, not because of punishment, but because of grace. And in the quiet authority of Samuel Briggs, every young soldier witnessed the kind of strength they hoped one day to earn. The hush that settled over the cafeteria after Briggs placed his hand on Keller's shoulder felt sacred, almost like the quiet that follows a heartfelt prayer. No one moved at first, not the young recruits, not the older guardsmen, not even Captain Ortega. It was as if the entire room had taken one collective breath and held it, letting the weight of Briggs' words sink into their bones. Then, slowly and almost instinctively, one soldier near the back straightened his spine, lifted his chin, and snapped to attention. He didn't do it for show. He didn't do it because he was told. He did it because something inside him demanded respect. Another soldier followed, then another. Chairs scraped against the linoleum floor in a growing wave of sound, soft at first, then deliberate as rows of young men rose to their feet. Boots clicked into place with disciplined precision. Even those who didn't fully understand Briggs' past knew from his humility, from the captain's reverence, from the trembling in Keller's voice, that they were standing in the presence of a man whose life had shaped their world long before theirs began. Respect wasn't requested. It was compelled by truth. Keller stood frozen in the middle of the room, still trembling from the lesson he had received. When he realized the entire cafeteria was rising to honor the man he had mocked, his shame deepened, but so did his understanding of what respect truly meant. He swallowed hard, forcing down the emotion burning in his chest, and stood at attention not from fear, but from reverence. His heart felt heavier, but also cleaner. It was the weight of growth, the weight of humility settling into place. Briggs blinked with quiet surprise when he noticed the soldiers rise. He hadn't asked for this moment. He had never wanted it. His life had been built on service, not recognition. His years in the UDT, swimming through dark waters under enemy fire, had not been for applause. They had been for country, for brothers in arms, for faith in something greater than himself. The sight of these young guardsmen honoring him stirred something deep and bittersweet within him. He exhaled softly, the corners of his lips lifting in a humble, almost embarrassed smile. "Boys," he said, his voice low but steady, "you don't have to do all this." But the room remained silent and unmoving, as steady as a line of sentinels. Respect doesn't bow to modesty. Respect stands firm. And every soldier in that cafeteria felt the unspoken conviction that this moment mattered, that future generations sitting at these same tables deserved to know about Samuel Briggs, the quiet ghost who had carried burdens far heavier than any of them could imagine. Captain Ortega stepped forward and saluted Briggs with crisp, unwavering precision. The gesture was sharp, clean, unmistakable. It was the kind of salute given only to men whose stories had shaped doctrines, not just memories. Briggs hesitated, then slowly returned the salute, though his hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from emotion. The captain's eyes glistened with a mix of admiration and gratitude. The silence in the cafeteria transformed from heavy to holy. A warm stillness spread through the room, the kind that settled into a man's conscience and stayed there. Some of the recruits felt tears prick at the corners of their eyes, moved by the raw humility of a man who had seen more than textbooks or training manuals could ever teach. They stood not just out of respect, but out of the quiet realization that they were witnessing the moment they would carry for the rest of their lives. Keller exhaled a shaky breath, the reality of everything hitting him like a tide. He stepped forward, stumbling slightly, until he reached Briggs. He fought to keep his voice steady, but the emotion cracked through anyway. "Sir, I'm sorry," he whispered, the words trembling but sincere. "I didn't know, and I had no right to say what I did." His apology wasn't for show. It came from the deepest part of him, the part that knew he had crossed a sacred boundary. Briggs placed a hand gently on Keller's forearm, offering a reassuring squeeze. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes conveyed everything: understanding, forgiveness, and a quiet belief that Keller would grow from this. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a murmur. "Son, what matters now is who you choose to be after this." The cafeteria absorbed every word. And as Briggs stepped back, the wall of young soldiers remained standing, their respect woven together like a single heartbeat. It was not a salute to glory. It was a salute to humility, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of an American hero. When the moment finally broke, it did so gently, like the soft closing of a church door after a long prayer. Captain Ortega stepped beside Briggs, his expression still carrying the weight of the revelation. He spoke quietly, but every soldier felt the reverence in his tone. "Sir, let me walk you out," he said, as though guiding a man of sacred history rather than a simple guest. Briggs nodded, still modest, still uncomfortable with the attention, but grateful for the captain's respect. Together, they began to move toward the exit. As they walked, soldiers made way with near instinctive precision, forming a loose, respectful corridor. Boots shifted to the side. Backs straightened, heads bowed subtly as Briggs passed. He tried to smile politely at them, but emotion tightened his throat. He hadn't expected any of this, not the recognition, not the reverence, and certainly not the chance to leave behind a lesson that might outlive him. He simply hoped the young men had taken something good from the moment. Keller remained rooted to the spot, watching the old man step through the sea of soldiers. He felt something shift deep inside him, the kind of shift that rewrites a man's character from the inside out. He had entered the cafeteria that day craving attention, eager to prove something. But now, watching Briggs walk away, he understood that real strength doesn't shout. It doesn't mock. It doesn't need applause. Real strength moves quietly, speaks gently, and stands firmly on a foundation of sacrifice. Whispers began spreading across the cafeteria in low, reverent tones. "That's the quiet ghost," someone murmured. "The UDT diver from Lady." Another soldier whispered details he had learned from reading old training. Manual stories of men who swam for miles in pitch-black water, carrying knives and explosives, praying they would reach shore before being spotted. Whether or not the younger recruits understood every detail didn't matter. What mattered was the tone: respect, awe, patriotism rooted in truth. Captain Ortega held the door open for Briggs, who stepped out into the crisp morning air. The breeze carried the scent of dry leaves, diesel, and the faint aroma of breakfast drifting from the cafeteria. Briggs paused, standing quietly at the threshold, taking in the sky, the flag fluttering nearby, the faint hum of soldiers preparing for training outside. For a moment, the world felt still. He bowed his head slightly, whispering a private prayer for the young men he'd met, for the ones they would become, and for the country they served. Inside the cafeteria, the soldiers slowly returned to their seats, but the atmosphere remained changed. Conversations resumed in soft tones, each young recruit processing what he had witnessed. Many felt humbled. Some felt inspired. All felt transformed. The story they had lived through one, they would undoubtedly pass down to those who came after, was now part of the unit's unwritten history. A story of a young man's arrogance, an old man's grace, and a truth that froze a room. Keller sat down last, staring at his cold meal, no longer hungry. He knew this moment would stay with him for years, shaping the kind of soldier and man he would become. He breathed in slowly, feeling the weight of the lesson settle deeper. Respect those who walked before you, because you never know which quiet face in the room carries the history that made your freedom possible. The cafeteria felt different now, marked by the echo of what had happened. Briggs' chair sat empty, but it carried a presence all its own. Someone placed a folded napkin on it, a small gesture of honor, a symbol that the room would remember. Others nodded in agreement, recognizing that small acts sometimes say what words cannot. As Briggs and the captain disappeared around the corner, a final thought settled over the unit like a soft blanket of truth. Heroes rarely look the way you expect. They don't demand respect, they earn it quietly, through sacrifice carved into their souls. And sometimes, if you're fortunate, one of them walks into your life just long enough to show you what honor really means. The legacy of that day stayed behind, carried in the hearts of every guardsman present, a living reminder that humility is strength. Respect is earned through sacrifice, and the quietest men often carry the heaviest stories.